The mess hall of the Naval Training Base was a constant storm of sound-clattering trays, shouted jokes, laughter mixed with groans from the day's grueling drills. The scent of reheated rations hung in the air, mingling with the tongue of sweat that seemed embedded in the walls. For most recruits, this was the single space where discipline loosened, where they could sprawl, laugh, curse, and pretend for 30 minutes that they weren't being hammered into soldiers. She entered quietly, carrying her tray as though the weight of it mattered. Nobody noticed her at first. She moved with that strange balance of invisibility and presence, like someone who had long ago learned how to disappear in plain sight. No slouch in her posture, no hesitation in her step, but not a hint of arrogance either. Just quiet certainty. Her boots struck the floor with rhythm, yet they made no sound louder than the shuffle of dozens of others. She bypassed the tables crowded with noisy groups and slipped to the farthest corner, setting down her tray and sitting with measured calm. One hand adjusted her sleeve neatly before she picked up her fork. To most, she was an anomaly in uniform. Smaller than most, her frame didn't scream brute strength. She never raised her voice during drills, never boasted, never fought for attention. Where others exaggerated their toughness, she conserved energy, like someone who understood survival was about endurance, not display. But recruits talked. They always did. 6 of them sat together halfway down the hall. They had noticed her weeks ago. At first, it was harmless curiosity. Who was she, and why didn't she join anyone? Then it shifted into mockery. They called her ghost behind her back, whispering that she wouldn't last through the next evaluation. Some wondered aloud if she had pulled strings to even get this far. Now, watching her eat alone again, the 6 exchanged looks. Boredom in a mess hall breeds trouble, and arrogance seeks a target. She had become their target. One of them, a tall recruit with a shaved head and a chip on his shoulder from high school football glory, leaned forward. "Bet she doesn't even make it through weapons qualification," he muttered. His voice carried just enough for his friends to hear. Another recruit snorted. "She probably cries herself to sleep. Look at her sits there like she's too good for everyone." "Or too scared," added a third, his grin sharp. "Mess hall's the only place you see the truth. She's weak. Doesn't belong here." They all chuckled, the kind of mean laughter that spreads when one person's insecurity feeds another's. But beneath the laughter sat something unspoken resentment. She didn't brag like they did, didn't stumble like others, and she never seemed rattled by the endless punishments instructors dished out. To them, that silence wasn't strength. It was arrogance, and arrogance begged to be cut down. Across the hall, she lifted her glass of water, taking slow, measured sips. Her eyes never rose, never acknowledged the stares or the whispers. Yet every movement was deliberate, efficient, like someone who knew they were always being watched, even when the world pretended otherwise. The 6 recruits couldn't stand it. They wanted her to flinch, to break, to prove she didn't deserve to wear the same uniform. And if she wouldn't do it herself, they would help her along. The tall one pushed back his chair with a scrape that drew attention. "Let's go educate her," he muttered. His buddies smirked and followed, forming a loose half-circle as they strode across the hall. Around them, conversation slowed. Forks hovered over trays, and laughter dimmed. The crowd smelled trouble the way sailors smell storms before the clouds roll in. Trouble always drew eyes. Nobody wanted to intervene, but everyone wanted to see what would happen. At her corner table, she continued eating. A bite of rice, a slow chew, a sip of water. Her face betrayed nothing. Her eyes, though lowered, were not unfocused. They flicked once, barely, toward the reflection in her glass. 6 figures moving closer. 6 shadows lengthening across the floor. Her breathing remained steady. The recruits reached her table and spread out, blocking her only exit. Their leader leaned forward, one hand slamming down on the table, the silverware rattling. His smirk was wide, practiced, but his eyes glittered with challenge. "You lost, sweetheart?" His voice carried, drawing a ripple of laughter from nearby tables. "This ain't the corner cafe. This is where warriors eat." Behind him, another chuckled, adding, "You hiding out over here because you can't keep up? Or is it because you're scared someone will notice you don't belong?" The others piled on, their comments sharper, mocking her silence. To the recruits watching, it looked like a pack of wolves circling a lone deer. Entertainment, a break from monotony. But to anyone truly observant, the energy was different. She wasn't folding inward. She wasn't shrinking. Her hands rested loosely on the edge of the tray. Her fork lay parallel to her knife, aligned perfectly, as if she had all the time in the world. Her back was straight, her shoulders squared. She didn't look trapped. She looked ready. The tall recruit expected protest, some flustered denial, maybe a plea. Instead, she raised her eyes slowly. Calm, steady, unwavering. That gaze was worse than any insult. It unsettled him. His smirk faltered for the briefest second before he recovered. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only his friends and the surrounding tables could hear. "You think you're tough? This isn't high school gym class. You don't survive here by hiding in corners." Her expression didn't change. She set her fork down gently. The mess hall seemed to grow quieter. Chairs squeaked as bodies shifted for a better view. Somewhere, a tray clattered to the floor, but nobody looked. Every eye was on the corner table, where 6 recruits stood bristling with arrogance, and one woman sat unmoved. It was the tension before lightning strikes, the moment when air feels too thick to breathe. The crowd didn't know why, but something about her calmness made the confrontation feel less like bullying, and more like a mistake unfolding in slow motion. The tall recruit straightened, puffing his chest. His pride couldn't tolerate silence. "What's the matter?" He taunted louder now. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're waiting for someone to save you?" The line drew scattered laughter, but it sounded hollow. The audience wasn't laughing at her. They were laughing because they didn't know what else to do. Then came the moment. One of the 6, impatient with a refusal to respond, stepped forward and clamped a hand on her shoulder. His fingers pressed hard, meant to intimidate. His grin widened as he looked to his friends. And that was the mistake. Her head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if she had just been given permission. Her muscles tensed under the grip, not in fear, but in readiness. The mess hall, once noisy and alive, now felt like the inside of a drum, waiting for the first strike. 45 seconds later, nothing in that room would ever be the same. The instant his hand gripped her shoulder, the atmosphere shifted. The mess hall had been loud minutes before, alive with laughter and scraping trays. Now it was a tomb. The recruits who had leaned in for entertainment realized they were witnessing something different, though they didn't yet know what. Her body didn't flinch. Instead, it tightened like coiled wire. She lifted her gaze to the hand on her shoulder, then up to the recruit's face. His grin widened, mistaking her calm for paralysis. But in that breath between action and reaction, something ancient stirred, the part of her trained to survive, trained to end threats without hesitation. With one sharp motion, she trapped his wrist against her shoulder, rotated her body, and twisted. The sound was sickening, tendons strained, joints popped. The recruit cried out, dropping to one knee, pain flooding his expression. Gasps erupted across the room. The silence shattered into stunned murmurs. Before anyone processed what happened, another stepped forward, anger overtaking reason. "Hey," he barked, charging toward her with fists clenched. She didn't rise to meet him. She pivoted her chair sideways, using its metal edge as leverage. As he lunged, she shifted her weight and guided his momentum forward. He tripped over her leg, colliding headfirst into the edge of the table. Trays clattered, food splattered across the floor, and he crumpled with a groan. The crowd fell into complete silence. 2 down, 4 to go. The remaining recruits hesitated. They weren't facing the timid loner they had mocked for weeks. They were staring at something else entirely, someone who had turned their bravado into humiliation in less than 10 seconds. But pride is stubborn, and pride doesn't retreat easily, especially in front of an audience. One spat on the floor. She thinks she's tough. Let's put her down. Together, 2 lunged at once, hoping numbers would overwhelm her. She finally rose from her chair, smooth and deliberate, as though she had planned every second of this. Her movements weren't frantic. They were surgical. The first recruit swung wide. She ducked under his arm, twisted her hips, and delivered a precise strike to his ribs with her elbow. Air whooshed from his lungs. Before he could recover, she swept his legs from beneath him, and he crashed onto the tiles, gasping. The second tried to grab her from behind. She bent low, seized his wrist, and flipped him over her shoulder. His back slammed against the table's edge with a hollow thud, the sound making even hardened recruits wince. He rolled onto the floor, clutching his spine. Now only 2 remained. Their faces had lost all arrogance. What once glimmered with mockery now shone with fear and disbelief. They looked not at her, but at each other, silently asking, "Do we keep going?" The crowd around them had already made its decision. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered insults. Every recruit stared wide-eyed at the display, unfolding like a lesson none of them had expected. The 2 froze. She didn't advance, didn't mock, didn't gloat. She adjusted her sleeve, her breathing steady, as though she had just completed an ordinary drill. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were sharp, carrying that strange weight of someone who had walked darker paths than they could imagine. The leader, still clutching his twisted wrist, staggered upright. This is nothing," he stammered, trying to recover some semblance of dignity. "She just got lucky." His words were weak, unconvincing even to himself. The 5th recruit, chest heaving, looked toward the crowd. Dozens of eyes burned back at him, waiting to see what he'd do. He clenched his fists, pride chaining him to a fight he no longer wanted. She finally spoke, her voice low but cutting through the silence like steel. "You don't want this." It was the first sound she had made since the confrontation began, and it carried more power than the strikes that had floored their friends. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was truth. The 5th recruit froze. His fists dropped slightly, hesitation winning over bravado. But the 6th, driven by stubborn ego, snarled and lunged anyway. She didn't wait. As he closed the distance, she stepped aside, catching his arm mid-swing. Her body rotated, redirecting his momentum with flawless efficiency. He hit the ground flat on his stomach. In one fluid motion, she knelt, locking his arm behind him until his shout of pain filled the hall. It was over. 45 seconds. That's all it had taken. The 6 who had stalked across the mess hall, brimming with swagger, now lay scattered across the floor, gasping, clutching bruises, and nursing sprains. The tables around them bore the evidence: overturned trays, spilled drinks, stunned silence. And at the center stood the quiet woman, her uniform unruffled, her breathing calm, her gaze unshaken. The recruits watching didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They were too stunned. What they had witnessed wasn't just a scuffle. It was a display of something deeper, something honed beyond ordinary training. She didn't linger on their stares. She released the pinned recruit gently, letting him scramble backward. Then she returned to her chair, straightened her tray, and picked up her fork again. To her, it was done. To everyone else, it had only just begun. A silence stretched long enough for the humiliation to sink in. The six, who moments before had strutted like predators, now looked like children who had touched fire and learned its burn. Finally, someone near the back whispered, "What the hell was that?" The words carried across the room, unanswered. Nobody dared speak louder, but the thought rippled through every mind. Who was she, and how had she done that? As she resumed eating, her composure unbroken, one truth settled into the bones of every recruit who had witnessed it. They had underestimated her gravely. And though none of them could articulate it yet, they were starting to suspect the truth. The quiet woman wasn't just another trainee. She was something else entirely. And the real revelation hadn't even begun. The mess hall was a battlefield without gunfire. Trays lay overturned, food smeared across the tiles like splashes of mud, and 6 recruits sprawled in various states of defeat. Their groans punctured the silence, each one a reminder of how swiftly arrogance had collapsed. The rest of the room sat frozen, 100 pairs of eyes locked on the quiet woman at the corner table. She wasn't gloating, wasn't towering over her opponents. She was simply eating again, chewing calmly, as if nothing had happened. That composure unsettled them more than the fight itself. Whispers broke out, timid at first, then gathering momentum. "Did you see?" She dropped him in one move. No way a normal trainee does that. Every voice carried the same tremor, disbelief. The 6 tried to recover. The leader, wrists swollen and pride shattered, forced himself upright. His knees wobbled, but he planted his feet, trying to salvage dignity. "This isn't over," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. His voice cracked, heard by everyone, and drew a ripple of pity more than fear. One of his friends staggered to a chair, holding his ribs, wheezing with each breath. Another leaned heavily against the wall, eyes wide, refusing to meet hers. The rest gathered themselves slowly, as though the floor itself had turned hostile. They didn't look like predators anymore. They looked like children who had picked the wrong fight. Still, she said nothing. Her silence pressed down heavier than insults ever could. Each recruit knew instinctively. If she had wanted to, she could have hurt them worse. She hadn't. That restraint was terrifying. Then the doors creaked open. The chief petty officer stepped in. His boots struck the tile with authority, echoing like drumbeats. The murmurs died instantly. Even the groans of the wounded recruits hushed, replaced by the nervous shifting of bodies. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with sharp eyes that had seen 1,000 mistakes. His gaze landed on the overturned trays, the recruits on the floor, and finally on her, sitting in the corner like the storm had never touched her. The chief's jaw tightened. He didn't need explanations. The scene told him everything. "On your feet," he barked. The 6 scrambled, stumbling upright, trying to straighten uniforms that now looked pitifully wrinkled. They stood in a loose line, heads bowed, avoiding his eyes. The chief's voice thundered again. "What happened here?" Silence. No one dared answer. He turned his glare on the 6. "Well?" "Speak." The leader swallowed hard. "Sir, we were just talking, and she—" His voice faltered under the chief's stare. He looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "She what?" The chief pressed, stepping closer. "She defended herself when 6 of you cornered her like jackals?" "That's what I see." The recruit flinched as though struck. The others shifted nervously, their arrogance dissolving in the weight of authority. The chief let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate. Then he pivoted toward her. "You didn't tell them, did you?" She shook her head once, a simple, controlled gesture. The chief exhaled slowly, almost a sigh, but not of disappointment. It was something else acknowledgement. Then his eyes swept the room, meeting every recruit who was watching. His next words carried like thunder. You all think strength is about how loud you can shout, how hard you can flex, how much you can intimidate. You think this uniform is earned with swagger. Look around you. Do you see swagger standing? The recruit's eyes darted to the six, still pale and trembling. No, the chief growled. Because swagger crumbles. Real strength doesn't. He pointed at her, not with malice, but with certainty. This woman understands strength. She doesn't have to prove herself with noise. She doesn't have to brag. She doesn't have to start fights. She ends them. The room was silent again. No one dared shift. The chief's gaze softened briefly as he turned back to her. You chose not to tell them who you are. Her eyes met his. She gave the faintest shrug, as if to say it hadn't mattered. And perhaps to her it hadn't, but to everyone else it did. The recruits leaned forward, breaths held, waiting for the missing piece of the puzzle. Her skill, her calm, her restraint, none of it fit the picture of an ordinary trainee. They wanted the answer, even feared it, because answers change everything. The chief didn't give it yet. He let the silence stretch, let the weight build. He wanted the lesson to etch itself into their bones before the truth came. Discipline, he said finally, pacing the room. Control, precision. Those are what keep you alive when everything else falls apart. Those are what make warriors. Without them, you're just children playing soldier. She understands. You don't, not yet. The 6 recruits burned with humiliation, but none dared argue. He stopped pacing and faced the crowd. You all just witnessed something you'll remember for the rest of your careers. 45 seconds that taught you more than I could teach in a week. You saw what happens when arrogance meets discipline. His words hit harder than any punishment drill. Finally, his eyes returned to her, steady, measured. He gave a single nod respect, unspoken but clear. Then he addressed the 6. Dismissed. Report to medical. And pray you learn something. The 6 stumbled out, dragging their pride like broken luggage. When the doors closed, the mess hall exhaled. But the tension didn't leave. It stayed, humming beneath the skin of every recruit present. Because the biggest question still lingered, unspoken, but burning in their minds. Who was she, really? She returned to her meal, unbothered, as though the chief's arrival hadn't shifted the room's gravity. Her silence, once mocked, now commanded awe. She didn't explain herself. She didn't need to. And that was the most unnerving part. The recruits whispered again, quieter this time, reverent almost. Speculation rippled through the hall like electricity. Special forces? No way. She's too young. You saw her moves. Nobody learns that in boot camp. Every whisper added to the legend forming before their eyes. And though the chief hadn't revealed the truth yet, everyone sensed they were standing on the edge of it. Because what had just unfolded wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. And soon, the revelation would come. The mess hall carried a silence that felt heavier than noise. Every recruit sat rigid, trays forgotten, food growing cold. The clash was over, but the atmosphere vibrated as if the walls themselves remembered the blows, the twists, the cries. The 6 had gone escorted out with humiliation dripping from their shoulders. Yet their absence didn't clear the tension. If anything, it grew thicker, settling on every recruit who had witnessed the 45 seconds that would echo far longer than the bruises left behind. She remained in her corner, composed, fork in hand. It was impossible to believe that the sane hands had just dismantled 6 men with mechanical precision. The contrast was jarring, violence and serenity living in the same person. The chief petty officer stayed standing, his boots planted firmly as if anchoring the room. His arms were crossed, and his eyes swept over the rows of recruits. He hadn't dismissed them. He wasn't finished. "Look at her," he commanded. Every head turned toward the quiet woman. Not with curiosity, not with gossip. Look at her and ask yourself what you just saw. Because if you think it was luck, if you think it was desperation, then you've learned nothing. The recruits shifted uncomfortably. Nobody dared speak. The chief began pacing slowly, each step deliberate, echoing like the slow beat of a drum. "You six," he barked suddenly, pointing toward a cluster of recruits who had watched the fight from the middle tables. They stiffened. "What did you see?" One hesitated before answering. "Sir," she moved like she knew exactly what they'd do before they did it. The chief's gaze didn't soften. "And you?" He pressed another. "She didn't waste anything, sir." Every strike was controlled. A third stammered. "It was?" "It was like training, sir. Like drills, but faster. Perfect." The chief nodded once. "Good. You noticed. That's the first step." He stopped pacing and turned back to the woman. "And you? You could have broken bones. You could have done permanent damage. But you didn't." Her eyes lifted briefly, then dropped again. She said nothing. "That's the difference," the chief continued, voice carrying through the hall. "Strength isn't about proving you can destroy someone. It's knowing when you don't have to." The recruits sat transfixed. They weren't watching a lecture. They were witnessing a dismantling of their assumptions, the undoing of weeks of bravado. The chief let the silence grow again, then broke it like glass. "Discipline is what separates warriors from brawlers. Brawlers fight for pride. Warriors fight for survival. Which do you want to be?" The question landed like a hammer. Nobody answered. They didn't need to. Every one of them knew the wrong answer had already played out before their eyes. He shifted his gaze across the hall, stopping at the woman once more. "Do you think she cared about proving herself to those six?" "No, she doesn't have to. She's lived through trials none of you can imagine. She doesn't measure herself against boys who mock what they don't understand." The words sank in. Some recruits swallowed hard. Others looked down at their trays, ashamed. The chief's tone softened not in volume, but in weight. "What you saw today wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. It was a mirror. And if you're wise, you'll look into it and decide whether you belong here." A chair creaked as someone shifted nervously. The room felt like a church, reverent, every sound magnified. Then the chief said something that sent ripples through the air. "She didn't tell you who she is. And maybe she never would have. But now you've forced it." Every recruit leaned forward, breaths held. Who she was. The whispers that had started after the fight now hung unspoken, crystallized into a single thought shared by everyone. She isn't one of us. The chief turned his back to the room, hands clasped behind him, as though wrestling with the decision. When he spoke again, his voice carried gravity. "There are paths in this military that most of you will never touch. Paths reserved for the few who endure beyond human limits. You train for months. They train for years. You fear exhaustion. They live in it. You pray for comfort. They forget it exists." He pivoted sharply, his eyes burning. "Do you think what you saw today can be learned in a few weeks of drills?" No one answered. They didn't dare. Discipline, precision, control. These are carved into the bones of those who survive that path. And she, he pointed toward her again, voice steady, unshakable, is walking proof of it. Gasps whispered through the hall. Some recruits exchanged glances, wide-eyed. Others simply stared at her, as though seeing her for the first time. She remained still, unbothered by the weight of attention. Her fork rested neatly beside her plate, her hands folded lightly. She hadn't asked for this spotlight. She hadn't sought to be the lesson. But she didn't shrink from it either. The chief studied her for a long moment, then addressed the recruits again. What you witnessed in those 45 seconds wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was training, the kind of training most of you couldn't endure for a day. The tension swelled to breaking. Everyone knew the reveal was near. The chief's jaw flexed, as if testing the taste of his next words. He let them hang on the edge, savoring the suspense. He wanted the recruits to feel the weight before it fell. And then he stopped. "Not yet," he said abruptly, almost to himself. His eyes swept the hall. "You're not ready to hear it. Not until you understand what it means." A collective exhale rippled across the room. Frustration mingled with awe, but nobody dared challenge him. The truth would come, but only when he decided. The woman's lips curled ever so slightly. Not a smile, but something close. She understood the game. She had played it before. The recruits sat restless, questions gnawing at them, but the mess hall remained locked in silence. The chief had given them enough for one day. The shock, the lesson, and the burden of curiosity. The full truth could wait. But the seeds were planted, and every recruit knew it. They had mocked a ghost in the corner, and now that ghost haunted them with questions they couldn't answer. And the revelation, when it came, would hit harder than any strike she had delivered. The mess hall carried a restless hum in the hours that followed. Word of the fight spread faster than wildfire, carried by whispers down corridors, into training fields, and across the barracks. Every retelling stretched the seconds longer, painted the moves sharper, until the legend outgrew the reality. Yet the recruits who had been there, the ones who had truly seen, knew exaggeration wasn't needed. The truth alone was heavy enough. But none of them knew the whole truth. Not yet. The chief had withheld it deliberately, letting curiosity gnaw at them, forcing them to stew in their own uncertainty. Some recruits speculated she had advanced martial arts training. Others swore she was secretly an instructor planted to test them. A few even whispered about intelligence divisions, about black projects and ghost units. The not knowing ate of them worse than bruises. The 6 who had started it all walked around camp with their heads lowered. They didn't dare speak about what happened. Their shame was public, carved into their reputations like scars. No one mocked her now. No one even approached her. Days passed. She trained as if nothing had changed, running drills, carrying weight, sweating through the same punishing routines as everyone else. Her presence had shifted the entire rhythm of the group. Where recruits had once laughed and shoved through exercises, they now moved sharper, quieter, as though fearing her calm gaze might catch laziness. Discipline grew in her shadow. It wasn't until the end of the week that the chief gathered them in the drill yard. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the packed dirt. Rows of recruits stood at attention, eyes fixed forward, nerves taut. The air itself seemed to wait. The chief's voice cut through. "You've been whispering." No one moved. "You've been asking questions, making up answers, filling silence with speculation. That ends now." He paced slowly, his boots grinding against the dirt, gaze shifting from one recruit to the next. "It's time you learned the truth." He stopped in front of her. She stood in line with the rest, posture perfect, expression unreadable. "This one," the chief said, his voice carrying with absolute clarity, "is not like you. She is not here to test whether she belongs. She already proved that, long before any of you put on this uniform." A ripple of unease swept through the ranks. "She belongs to a brotherhood, and now, a sisterhood that accepts only the few who survive the impossible. You trained for weeks. They trained for years. You break under exhaustion. They break and keep going. You fear failure. They fear only wasting breath. The recruit stood frozen, breaths shallow, as the chief's words built toward revelation. She is one of them. Silence thundered louder than sound. She is a Navy SEAL. The words struck like artillery. Some recruits blinked in disbelief, as if their ears had betrayed them. Others felt their hearts sink, understanding at once why her calmness had unsettled them, why her strikes had carried that deadly precision. A few, particularly the 6 who had cornered her, looked as though the ground had vanished beneath them. Their humiliation deepened into something darker. Awe. The chief's gaze sharpened. Do you understand now? What you mocked. What you underestimated. Still, no one dared to speak. He continued, his voice rising. The Navy SEALs are not just special forces. They are the edge of the spear, the answer when every other option fails. And you, he swept his arm across the rows of recruits, you thought you could break her with words. You thought you could shame her with jeers. You thought she was fragile because she chose silence. He paused, letting the weight settle. But silence is not weakness. It is focus. It is discipline. It is the weapon that cuts deepest when the time comes to strike. Her eyes remained forward, her jaw steady. She hadn't flinched when the title was spoken aloud. She hadn't moved when the gasps rippled. She stood as she always had present, unwavering, unshaken. The chief turned back toward her. You didn't reveal it yourself. Why? Finally, she spoke. Her voice was even, steady, without pride or apology. Because, Chief, identity means nothing. Performance means everything. A murmur of astonishment rolled through the recruits. She didn't care for titles. She didn't claim superiority. She only lived the standard. The chief's lips tightened into the barest trace of a smile. And that is why she wears the trident. Gasps broke again. For many recruits, a Navy SEAL trident was the ultimate symbol, the pinnacle of military endurance and excellence. To imagine it pinned to her chest, this quiet figure they had once dismissed, was almost beyond comprehension. Understand this, the chief thundered. Every second you train beside her is a gift. Every mile you run, every push-up you grind, every moment you think you've reached your breaking point, she has already been there and gone further. Learn from her, or you'll waste your chance to become more than you are. He let the silence follow, heavy and absolute. When he dismissed them, no one moved casually. No one muttered under their breath. They dispersed like shadows, each one carrying the revelation like a private burden. The 6 who had cornered her lingered, hesitant, torn between shame and the need to apologize. None of them found the courage to approach. She walked past them without a glance, her silence cutting sharper than words ever could. That night, the barracks whispered again, not with speculation, but with awe. Stories grew around her name, but this time they were rooted in truth. She had been declared what few ever dreamed to become, and she hadn't needed to prove it with words or swagger. 45 seconds had been enough. She became, in that moment, more than a recruit. She became a mirror reflecting to each of them the gap between bravado and discipline, between noise and mastery, between who they were and what they might become if they endured. And though she never sought it, her legend had begun. The yard was emptying when the chief dismissed them, but the silence he left behind clung like fog. Recruits moved stiffly, boots crunching in perfect rhythm, as if afraid to break the invisible weight that hung in the air. They carried the words with them, the declaration that had cracked their assumptions in half. She is a Navy SEAL. It wasn't just a title. It was a sentence that rewrote everything they thought they knew about strength, about discipline, about themselves. In the barracks that night, no one laughed. Jokes about sore muscles, about blisters and instructors, died before reaching lips. Beds creaked as recruits settled quietly, their minds replaying the mess hall fight like a film stuck on loop. 6 men, healthy, strong, brimming with pride, had been dismantled in less than a minute. And the woman who did it hadn't broken a sweat. The 6 themselves lay restless. Their humiliation gnawed at them deeper than bruises. They had mocked what they didn't understand, and in doing so, revealed their ignorance to everyone. They tried to convince themselves they had just been unlucky. That surprise had played against them. But they couldn't ignore the precision, the calm, the deliberate restraint. She hadn't needed luck. She had needed only discipline. And now every recruit knew it. The next morning, training began as usual, but the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. When she jogged onto the field in formation, heads tilted subtly, eyes measuring, she ran with the same even pace, the same steady breath. She didn't lead, didn't lag, simply blended in. Yet blending in now felt impossible. Every stumble, every grunt of exhaustion around her suddenly carried new weight. If she didn't falter, what excuse did anyone else have? The 6 who once strutted through drills now kept their eyes lowered, grinding harder, desperate to erase the stain of their arrogance. Others, though, found themselves chasing her rhythm, pushing farther, fueled by the quiet shame of being shown up. The chief saw it all. During log carries, he barked commands sharper than usual, his eyes flicking toward her more often than the rest. He didn't need to explain. The message was clear. She wasn't the outlier. She was the standard. If she could shoulder weight without complaint, so could they. If she could press through pain without faltering, so could they. And still, she said nothing. Her silence grew heavier by the day, turning her into something more than human in their eyes. A myth in motion. A constant reminder of their inadequacies. But also a beacon. One evening, after a brutal day of drills, the recruits collapsed onto benches in the mess hall. Plates clattered, conversations buzzed low. The 6 sat together, huddled, their pride still bleeding. One of them finally muttered, "We should say something." "Say what?" Another snapped bitterly. "Sorry we tried to humiliate you? Sorry we didn't know you could crush us in under a minute?" The first hesitated, then shook his head. Doesn't matter. She wouldn't care anyway. And maybe that was the worst part. She didn't seek acknowledgement. She didn't hold grudges. She had moved on as if the incident meant nothing, while for them it had become everything. Later that week, the chief gathered them again. This time, it was under the dim glow of floodlights on the obstacle course. The air was cool, the ground damp from an earlier rain. He paced before them, his expression hard. "Do you know why she doesn't brag?" he asked. The recruits remained silent, breath steaming in the night air. Because bragging wastes air. Because in the field, noise gets you killed. Because warriors don't measure themselves by the weakness of others. They measure themselves by survival. He let the words pierce the silence. You saw what survival looks like when discipline and training fuse into instinct. You saw control, precision, restraint. And you should be grateful. His gaze swept over the 6. Because if she hadn't restrained herself, half of you wouldn't be standing here tonight. The recruits stiffened. The 6 looked at the ground. The chief's voice softened, carrying more weight than when it thundered. This isn't about shame. This is about understanding. Strength isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the one who doesn't need to speak. The recruits turned their eyes toward her. She stood among them as always, posture perfect, silent, her presence both comforting and unsettling. She hadn't flinched when the chief spoke of her. She hadn't shifted when the 6 bowed their heads. She simply remained steady, as though discipline was her natural state. That night, whispers spread again, but they were different now. Not rumors, not speculation, respect. Some recruits spoke her name with awe. Others avoided it altogether, as if saying it too loudly might shatter the fragile balance she brought to their world. The 6 avoided her gaze, but slowly something changed in them. Their arrogance eroded, replaced by quiet determination. They worked harder, pushed longer, not out of competition, but out of an unspoken need to rise from their shame. And though she never acknowledged them, never gave them a nod or a glance, her presence drove them harder than any insult or punishment could. Days turned into weeks. The legend of the 45 seconds didn't fade. It grew. Recruits from other divisions whispered about it, embellishing details, but the core truth remained the same. 6 against 1, and the 1 hadn't broken. She didn't deny the story. She didn't confirm it. She let silence carry it, and silence made it stronger. The chief, watching it all, knew exactly what he was doing. He had revealed her identity not just to humble the 6, not just to shock the recruits, but to set a standard that none of them could ignore. In the months to come, every push-up, every mile, every moment of exhaustion would carry the weight of a single truth. She was among them. If she endured, they could endure. If she stood unbroken, they had no excuse to fall. And though she never claimed leadership, never raised her voice, never once sought to command, she became something greater than authority. She became the measure by which they judged themselves. And none of them would ever forget it. The revelation didn't stay confined to the drill yard. Secrets in the military had a strange way of becoming stories, and stories had a stranger way of turning into legends. By the next sunrise, whispers had slipped from barracks to training fields, from mess halls to offices. What had happened in those 45 seconds was already echoing in corners she had never stepped into. Recruits who hadn't been there approached those who had, pestering them for details. Was it really 6 against 1? Did she break bones? How fast was it? Every retelling added fuel to the fire. Exaggeration grafted onto truth until the story took on a life of its own. Some swore she disarmed weapons that never existed. Others insisted she vanished and reappeared like a ghost. The reality was enough, but reality rarely satisfied curiosity. Still, the truth remained uncheckable. She was a Navy SEAL. The title carried weight far heavier than any rumor. To many, SEALs weren't people. They were symbols, shadows whispered about in the kind of awe reserved for legends of war. To have one among them, not as an instructor, not as a distant figurehead, but as a fellow recruit sweating under the same sun, grinding through the same mud, it changed everything. The 6 who had cornered her became unwilling celebrities in the tale. Their humiliation was etched into every retelling, their names tied forever to a story that spread like wildfire. Some recruits sneered at them behind closed doors, others pitied them. But no one forgot that it was their arrogance that had sparked the event. They carried the weight differently. One withdrew into silence, training harder than anyone, but rarely speaking. Another grew short-tempered, snapping at minor slights, his shame festering into bitterness. A third shifted into quiet respect, his arrogance stripped clean, his eyes always watchful when she moved. Each of them wrestled with the burden of being part of the story, the ones who had underestimated the storm and been swallowed by it. And she carried herself no differently. Morning runs found her in the same rhythm. Obstacle courses saw her with the same steady determination. She didn't train to prove anything. She trained because training was who she was. The revelation had changed everyone but her. Yet that very consistency magnified her legend. Every drop of sweat that fell from her brow, every disciplined breath, every silent endurance of pain became proof that the whispers were true. The recruits began to watch her in drills, comparing their own form to hers. They measured their endurance against her steady pace. Without saying a word, she had become the bar by which they judged themselves. The chief noticed. He watched how recruits pushed harder in her presence, how sloppiness evaporated when she was near. He never announced her as a leader, but he didn't need to. Authority didn't always come from rank. Sometimes it came from reputation. Sometimes it came from the weight of silence. By the third week after the reveal, even officers outside the training program had taken notice. She became the subject of casual conversations, the kind that began with disbelief and ended with quiet respect. A female SEAL? Some questioned, skeptical but curious. Others, more informed, nodded knowingly, aware that history had already begun to bend in that direction. Still, few could reconcile the idea with the sight of her, quiet, unassuming, never seeking attention. In the mess hall, the stares never stopped. Recruits no longer mocked her, no longer dared to. Instead, they watched, some with reverence, others with envy. She never sat in the middle. Always at the edges, always alone, as if the distance protected her calm. And maybe it did. The six avoided her at first, shame binding their tongues. But shame has a way of burning into fuel, and eventually one of them broke. It happened during a grueling field exercise under the midday sun. Packs weighed heavy, sweat poured, tempers frayed. When the order came to haul logs across uneven ground, one of the six faltered, his knees buckling. The others cursed under their breath, but before anyone else could step in, she was there, her shoulder sliding under the log, her stance steady, lifting weight without a word. The recruit stared at her, stunned. He expected scorn, maybe a cold glare. Instead, she gave him nothing. No words, no judgment. Just effort, quiet and unyielding. Afterward, when the drill ended and exhaustion dropped them all to the dirt, he found the courage to speak. "Why didn't you let me fall?" he asked, his voice raw. She wiped sweat from her brow, her eyes steady on the horizon. "Because falling doesn't teach you anything," she answered simply. Then she walked on. The words struck deeper than any lecture. The other five listened when he repeated them that night in the barracks. Something shifted between them, a silent agreement that pride had no place here anymore. They had been humiliated, yes, but they had also been given a chance, not to erase the past, but to rise from it. Slowly, they began to approach her, not with arrogance, but with humility. They asked quiet questions about form, about breathing, about pushing through pain. She never lectured. Her answers were as short as her strikes had been. Focus on rhythm. Control your breathing. Pain isn't the enemy. Panic is. Each word was practical, stripped of ego, grounded in experience. And though she never sought disciples, the six became just that. Their shame turned into respect, their arrogance into discipline. They stopped seeing her as the one who broke them, and started seeing her as the one who could make them better. The rest of the recruits noticed. The transformation of the six was as much a lesson as the fight itself. Where arrogance had failed, humility began to thrive. And it all traced back to her, the quiet presence who demanded nothing, yet reshaped everything. By the time the next inspection came, the unit had sharpened. Their formations were tighter, their movements crisper, their endurance longer. The chief knew why, though he never said it aloud. He didn't need to. The proof stood among them, silent, steady, carrying herself with the same calm she always had. Legends didn't need to announce themselves. They simply endured, until endurance turned into myth. And in those weeks, she wasn't just a SEAL in training. She was a living reminder of what every recruit could become, if only they had the discipline to silence their pride and listen to the lesson that 45 seconds had written into their bones. The sun rose over the base with a quiet brilliance that mirrored the transformation within its walls. Months had passed since the 45-second fight, but its echoes remained. Recruits no longer whispered about her with disbelief or fear. They spoke with reverence. She had become a benchmark, a silent measure against which every effort was gauged. Her name circulated with quiet awe, not as gossip, not as rumor, but as legend. The 6 who had cornered her were different now. Arrogance had been stripped away, replaced with humility sharpened like steel. They moved with a precision born from experience, their endurance longer, their focus sharper. They still remembered the pain, the embarrassment, but it had transformed into something productive, motivation. Other recruits had changed too. The rumor of her skill had traveled beyond their immediate group, whispered across training yards, barracks, and mess halls. She became a symbol of what was possible when silence, discipline, and training intersected. Where once people mocked or underestimated, they now studied and admired. The chief observed quietly, satisfaction hidden behind a stern face. He had intentionally revealed her identity, but only after allowing her skill and restraint to speak first. It was a calculated lesson, and its effects were undeniable. Recruits moved faster, trained harder, and carried themselves with a weight they hadn't had before. She had become the standard without issuing a single command. It was during one particularly grueling obstacle course that the culmination became undeniable. The recruits climbed, crawled, lifted, and hauled with a precision that bordered on obsession. Their breathing was synchronized, their movements disciplined, each step measured against her presence. And she moved as always calm, composed, silent, but every glance carried unspoken instruction. She wasn't leading them. She didn't have to. Her example was enough. The 6 approached her again that day, not with fear, not with brashness, but with questions grounded in respect. "How do you stay calm under pressure?" one asked. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Focus on what you can control," she said simply. "The rest doesn't matter." Another asked, "How do you push through pain without giving up?" Her reply was equally concise. "Pain is temporary. Discipline isn't. No lectures. No grand explanations. Just lessons distilled into words that carried the weight of lived experience." Other recruits watched, taking in every word, every movement, every silent moment. The mess hall fight, the 45 seconds, the chief's revelation, all had set the stage, but her continued presence had cemented the lesson. The story had grown from incident to myth, but the myth was real because she lived it every day. Weeks turned into months. Training accelerated, standards rose, and the base became a sharper, more disciplined place. Her influence wasn't overt. She didn't give commands or praise. She simply existed in the space, a living reminder of what mastery looked like when silence, strength, and training converged. The day of graduation arrived with an unusual energy. The recruits lined up in formations tighter than ever before. Their movements were crisp, their posture unyielding. Everyone knew the story of the 45 seconds. They knew who she was. But now, the lesson had matured from shock into respect, from awe into emulation. The 6 stood together, heads held slightly higher than before, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. Their shame had transformed into determination, their failure into fuel. They had been humbled, and they had risen stronger because of it. As the graduation ceremony unfolded, the chief walked along the ranks, inspecting each trainee. When his gaze reached her, it lingered a moment longer than the rest. Not out of judgment, but acknowledgement. She had changed lives without a single raised voice, without a single show of ego. Her victory was quiet, but it was profound. Whispers followed her through the ceremony. Recruits who had once doubted her now spoke in hushed tones about her skill, her restraint, her unwavering discipline. Even instructors, hardened by years of experience, nodded in quiet approval. They had seen few like her. Some had seen none. The legend of the 45 seconds had grown, but the reality of her continued presence gave it permanence. It wasn't a story to be exaggerated or dismissed. It was a standard to be followed. She had become the measure by which all future recruits would gauge themselves. A living example that excellence isn't claimed. It's earned silently and relentlessly. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the barracks emptied, she walked alone across the yard, her steps calm, measured. The 6 followed at a discreet distance, practicing the discipline she had silently instilled. Other recruits lingered, catching glimpses of her steady presence, internalizing lessons they hadn't yet fully articulated. The chief observed from the shadows, a rare trace of satisfaction in his eyes. The plan had worked beyond expectations. She hadn't led them through orders or commands. She hadn't shouted or forced compliance. She had simply existed as a benchmark, an unspoken standard, and in doing so, reshaped an entire unit. And that was the ultimate measure of her impact. Influence without display, authority without arrogance, legend without proclamation. Years would pass, and the story of the 45 seconds would continue to echo across the base, retold by those who had witnessed it, and by those who had learned about it secondhand. Each retelling would carry the awe, the respect, and the quiet reverence it deserved. But those who had seen her up close knew the truth. She wasn't a figure to be idolized. She was a standard to be met, a lesson to be lived, and a living embodiment of discipline perfected through action and silence. She left the yard quietly after the ceremony, unnoticed by most, but her influence lingered like the shadow of a mountain over the base. Every step, every movement, every quiet choice she made had reshaped those around her. The 6, now tempered and disciplined, walked taller, their focus sharper. The rest of the recruits carried her lessons into every aspect of their training. And the chief, watching from a distance, knew that what had started as a 45-second confrontation had become a legacy. In the end, she didn't need recognition. She didn't seek applause. Her legacy was etched in the changed habits, the sharpened focus, and the disciplined minds of every recruit who had witnessed her power and restraint. The 45 seconds became immortal, not because of the violence it contained, but because of the discipline it revealed, the humility it inspired, and the legend it created. And in that quiet, unassuming presence, she had achieved something far greater than victory. She had become a living measure of excellence, a silent teacher, and a legend that would endure long after the sun set on that base.